start? All right. Good evening. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Perfect. Good evening. My name is Ayla Amir, and in my role as the Executive Director of AMI-Quebec, I'm happy to welcome you to our first annual Mental Health Forum. This event is the successor of the Low Beer Memorial Lecture, which had been a main annual event for the past 30 years. Like its predecessor, the Mental Health Forum is aimed at raising awareness and understanding of mental health and illness-related issues. The Department of Psychology at Concordia University and the Center for Clinical Research in Health have collaborated with AMI-Quebec on this annual event, and we are grateful for their ongoing interest and support. I assume that many of you are familiar with AMI-Quebec, so I just would like to encourage you to sign up for our emails and visit our website often so you can stay up to date about our programs. Tonight's event will address the important subject and experience of ambiguous loss and grief associated with death. Ambiguous loss is a loss that remains unclear and without official verification or immediate resolution. The people we love can be physically gone, but kept psychologically present, or the opposite, physically present, but psychologically gone. This is often the case when serious mental health challenges strike. Mental illness often changes the trajectory of the diagnosed individual, but can also wreak havoc on the entire family. Changing expectations and gradual acceptance are accompanied by a sense of loss and grief. There may be no closure, but rather learning to live with ambiguity, uncertainty, and grief. Multi-level ambiguous losses on a global level were also experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic and continue in the face of climate change and many current crises throughout the world, which leads to an increase in anxiety, anger, and pain. Understanding ambiguous losses and learning how to cope and possibly strengthen resilience is the center of our conversation tonight. We will hear from Dr. Pauline Boss, who coined this term, and from Laurie and Jonathan, who will share their own experiences with ambiguous losses. Sonali Karnik, CBC host of All in the Weekend, will moderate the conversation. Questions from the audience are welcome. Whether you are attending in person or online, you can send in questions using your smartphones or computers. Visit amiquebec.org/forum, F-O-R-U-M, to submit your questions, or email them to amiquebec.org. The questions will be forwarded to the moderator, and she will integrate them into the discussion as needed. We will answer as many questions as possible, but we may not be able to get them all. I wish you all a stimulating conversations and would like to pass the baton to Sonali Karnik.
Well, before I sit down and behind the chair, I just want to say, one, that it is an honor for me to be here for AMI-Quebec's annual Mental Health Forum. And CBC, of course, is equally supportive of efforts to improve the lives of Canadians through organizations like this. Now, we may discuss some difficult or triggering topics this evening, and I would like our participants and as well as our audience to feel free to take a break if they need it. If you need to leave the room to chill out for a few minutes, please do that. And I'm sure we're all understanding that that is a possibility, and sometimes we will need to recenter. And we, as Ella mentioned, we're going to have a question period where members of the audience will be able to ask questions. We'll point out where the microphones will be at that time. I will let you know. And if you have any questions about asking a question, if you're listening online, just send an email. I will be able to see those questions, so I will check them out and get to as many as I can. On that note, please let me introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Pauline Boss is Professor Emerita at the University of Minnesota and was a family therapist for more than 40 years. In the 1970s, Dr. Boss coined the term ambiguous loss that is used in professional discourse and public circles. It began with her research for her doctoral dissertation with families of the missing in action in the South Vietnam after the Vietnam War, and with the veterans hospitals with patients who had Alzheimer's disease. She's traveled the world speaking with people who have experienced loss because of natural disasters, or war, or terror. Dr. Boss has also worked with people dealing with everything from stillbirth to divorce, where loss isn't maybe as clear. She's developed and tested the theory of ambiguous loss, a guide for working families of the missing, physically or psychologically, in over 100 peer-reviewed academic articles and chapters. And you can also read about that research and clinical work in the books she's written, including her first book, Ambiguous Loss, Learning to Live with Unresolved Grief, and Loving Someone Who Has Dementia, How to Find Hope While Coping with Stress and Grief, among other titles. Her work is known around the world, and her books are now available in 19 different languages. And we are honored to have her with us this evening. Please welcome Dr. Pauline Boss.
Hello. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm very interested in the topic of your organization, serious mental illness, because it is indeed an ambiguous loss. And as Sonali said correctly, it's the type of ambiguous loss where the person is physically present but psychologically absent. I guess it was AMI who said that. So we're going to talk tonight about the uncertainty and the pain that comes with not having a definitive diagnosis to an obvious problem that's happening in the family, and how one moves forward with life when life changes from that kind of unclear loss. Ambiguous loss is simply an unclear loss. But because it's unclear, it's very stressful. And it is the stress that causes trouble for the people who have to experience it, and also the people who live with those who experience it. So, Sonali, how should we proceed? Do you want to ask questions right off?
I think what we'll do is we will introduce our two guests, and then we will ask questions afterwards.
I need to hear you just a little better.
If those listening online, we're having some audio issues, we should be okay now.
I got it. I turned it up here.
Okay. For those listening online, sorry, we had some audio issues in the beginning. Seems everything is fixed now. Dr. Boss, I think we'll start with our first two guests, and then we'll start asking you a couple of questions. How about that?
Yes, sounds good.
First, I'd like to welcome Lori Tyrell. Lori, welcome.
Thank you.
Lori has worked in sales and marketing for more than 30 years. She is the mother of an adult child with mental health issues. Lori, how have you experienced ambiguous loss?
So I would say it started 6 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. We started to see just changes in his behavior. Things became erratic, and it was very, very slow. It was one of those things where I think my husband and I kind of said, oh, maybe he's, we would write it off. He's smoking weed, he's doing something, like it's one of those. And then all of a sudden, everything changed very quickly. He ended up making a decision. I mean, maybe that's not the right term, making the decision, but that was the result of it. He tried to take his life. And that caused a complete spiral for us as a family. So when I say to you, when you go into, as a husband and wife, you want to have children and have a family, and you have a plan, right? Everybody goes into something with a plan. So I'm using my example as a family. I'm sure it happens with many things, work life or, goals of the future. But in our scenario, we had a plan. We were going to have kids, and then, of course, you don't go into this going, okay, well, my kid is going to have a mental health issue down the road, and he's going to try and take his life multiple times, and that's going to put a lot of stress on our family. So the ambiguous loss that we ended up dealing with was the fact that this family that we thought we were going to have was no longer going to be. So that created fear, and that created what's next, and what can we do, and how will we get out of this? And dear Lord, you know, you start to think that it's over. So that for us was the loss.
How did that affect your mental health?
I would say it was 8 to 9 months that I stopped working. I took 8 to 9 months off of work right after he tried to hurt himself. It was literally right before Christmas, so it became a big thing. And I think for me it was questioning did I do something wrong? Did I not do something right? Why didn't we see this? How could I be a mother and not see? Like, you go through the blaming process, right? And then as a family, you know, my husband also was going through his own, trying to understand what was really happening and watching me fall apart. And then my daughter, who's sitting here as well, his sister definitely went through the whole, she wasn't here for part of it because she was studying abroad, but it was those talks of, like, I've lost my brother. So there was a huge amount of depression and pressure.
How did you manage those effects? What did you do for yourself to manage the stress that you were dealing with?
I cried a lot. I actually tried to just immerse myself in knowledge. So I spent a lot of time reading, and you know, I looked up every possible thing, everything the doctors would say. I would double check and triple check and look for experts in other parts of the world. I reached out to doctors in the US that had dealt with a drug. One of the drugs my son takes is Clozaril. It's a very intrusive drug. It's one of the antipsychotics. He takes a few of them. And many doctors in Canada were not comfortable to allow people to take that drug. It's one of the oldest drugs out there, but it works very well for what's called treatment-resistant schizophrenia. He has not been diagnosed with schizophrenia, but when it's treatment-resistant, they make the decision to allow that drug to be tried. So I spent time talking to a mom, actually, that I met in Ohio, who I don't know if you've ever heard of Brittany. I'm going to say her last name. I'm going to say it wrong. Yiser. She's a woman, a girl who went through schizophrenia, and her mom was a nurse. And there were 2 books written, one by her and one by her mom. And I read both from 2 different perspectives. And I actually went and met her mom, so that was kind of cool in Ohio to kind of look and understand and learn. So I just threw myself in to try and understand what we can do.
I asked this because when I have been through the process where I've had somebody in my family diagnosed with a fatal physical illness, and I did all the reading. And did you have the sense that if I do all this reading, I'm going to find the answer?
Absolutely. Because I'm smarter than everybody, right?
Right. Oh, of course, yeah.
It's very real, 100%. I spent many, many hours going, yeah, I'm just going to keep reading, and I'm going to keep reading. And then you just get to the point where you're honestly going to drive yourself crazy, because you start to realize that it's the same information, just said a couple of different words, said differently. So it was time, and then learning how to trust, and a few very good close friends that I have were able to kind of shake me out of it and go, you need to stop. You just need to stop, and we need to just give it time, and you need to get back to work, and you need to have a life. And I'm grateful to him for everything, because I'm not sure that I would have made it through without him. So
I'm going to move to Jonathan. We're going to get to where you are now at some point, but I want to talk to Jonathan as well. Our other panelist this evening is Jonathan Borenstein. Jonathan was diagnosed with complex regional pain syndrome 3 years ago. Yeah. And before his diagnosis, Jonathan was physically and socially active. His losses are more than just his physical limitations. Jonathan lost the life he once had but he's working on creating a new one for himself. Jonathan, how did you come to realize that the pain you were experiencing was more than just a one-off or an injury or as anything else that you could literally use to explain pain?
To be honest, it was a slow process. It started off where it was just really sensitive, my skin. And then as time went on, I noticed it was hurting to put on a shirt. It was hurting to take a shower. It was hurting everything, nonstop, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I just felt pain until it got to a point where I could barely even function, barely get out of bed. That changed everything for me, that feeling after it started.
How did that change your life? Like, when did you realize that this life you had as an active person was not the one you were going to have?
I think once I got diagnosed with complex regional pain syndrome is when I really noticed the difference. Like Lori, I read everything I could possibly find, whether it was online or books, talking to different doctors, different people. I found support groups online of people that I could talk to that were diagnosed with the same illness, and when I noticed that there was no cure, there was nothing that showed that there was a chance that this could just be medically fixed, that's when I noticed that I realized that everything was going to change for me.
How did that make you feel?
Pretty horrible, I'm not going to lie. One of the, specialists that I saw, she was a desensitization specialist, made a comment of another name for this disorder, and it's called the suicide disorder, because they say there's a high percentage of people who get diagnosed with this within the first year will end up taking their lives, just because the pain never ever goes away. So it was then that I really kind of came to the realization that this could be something a lot more serious.
Well, we're happy you're here with us.
Thank you, me too.
How did you manage those feelings or emotions when you were going through that pain? And obviously you went through a depression. Like, how did you manage that?
I know it's going to sound weird, but I spent a lot of time in my garage. My wife and I set up a couch and a TV for myself in there to kind of get away from everything. And that first year and a half was just spending a lot of time by myself, reading, looking up different ways, different ideas, different places I could go to try to help myself. And then actually it was my brother-in-law who mentioned I should start meditating, and I started that. We did a couple of sessions together, and that helped to kind of get my brain more on track and realize that there's more important things.
You also, and you had the added pressure, you're also a father.
Yes.
How much, we say mom guilt all the time, but there's parental guilt. How much parental guilt did you feel? A lot. I couldn't go to most of my son's baseball games because they were outside, and just the wind blowing would cause extreme amounts of pain. Picking my kids up, giving them a real hug. Like, everything I do is one-armed, so it really changed everything for my family, for myself, for anybody I deal with, yeah. Dr. Boss, I want to go back to you about these two different kinds of ambiguous loss. First, let's talk about Lori's situation in dealing with a family member who maybe is no longer what they are used to or has changed as a person. How is that ambiguous loss? I mean, how much do we see that kind of ambiguous loss, and do people acknowledge that that is, in fact, ambiguous loss?
Well, a couple things. First of all, she described the kind of ambiguous loss that I began in the 1970s to study. And I was studying the family, primarily, the family system. When somebody in the family has an ambiguous loss, like she described, definitely, but it affects the entire system. Now, Jonathan described what I have most recently called, in the latest book, personal ambiguous loss. Although it affects the family, the system we're talking about, where there is something missing, is his body, is him. And something that can't be fixed by the medical community apparently can be eased somewhat, but it is a condition that he will live with. As a loss of strength, a loss of comfort that he used to have. So that's personal ambiguous loss. And we see that a lot. A woman might lose the ability to have a child, to lose her organs to have a child. That's personal ambiguous loss. If, in fact, she was attached to the idea that she would have children. So attachment is still the underlying criterion for ambiguous loss. You have to love what you lost. You have to be attached to it. And I think both of you are attached to what it was you lost and are still attached to it. But there's not a fix. That's the problem with ambiguous loss. You have to learn to live with it. And I must say the two of you are admirable in how you have coped with this. We can talk more a little bit later about the way of both and thinking that helps to cope. But before I quit right now, let me say that you're both searching for information as you were in the beginning. That coping mechanism is in fact a good one. Yes, you can do too much of it because after a while, you've sort of reached the end of new information. But ambiguous loss leads to helplessness. That is, if you have a loved one who is not the way they used to be, or they're sick and you don't know what the diagnosis is, or you've lost something in your own body that can't be fixed, then you need to seek information in order not to be helpless or hopeless. Yet it's a process, so that comes to an end, and then you have to move on to more acceptance that you may have to live with the ambiguity the rest of your life. And then we can talk about how to do that later.
Well, I want to talk about another kind of loss as well that we see now. Of course, there's a lot more people being diagnosed with dementia and Alzheimer's, and there are, as we know, we've discussed this, of when you're a caregiver to that person, whether you're a live-in caregiver or it's somebody you know very well, and all of a sudden they don't recognize you, or they're not the person that you knew your entire life. That is also a form of ambiguous loss. Yeah. How do we, how do we manage that kind of a loss when it is maybe somebody that we're married to, a family member that is having dementia or Alzheimer's, and they no longer recognize us, or we are the ones that are, what my mother used to say, I'm thinking for two of us, that was the one managing everything. Yeah.
Well, resilience is the answer. When you have a problem that has no solution, when you have an illness that has no cure, when you have a mental illness that pops up every now and then with episodes, but you don't know when they're going to happen, then the main goal is building the resilience to tolerate ambiguity, to tolerate answers that have no questions. That's very un-American, and I'll bet it's un-Canadian too, because we like to have answers. We like to fix things. And we like to know what the problem is so we can win and fix it. Now, binary thinking doesn't work with the kinds of things we've been talking about here, where you either win or you lose. You're either absent or present. You're either sick or you're healthy. Any of those kinds of ways of thinking are not helpful here. So we moved from binary thinking, either or thinking, to what I call both and thinking, more dialectical thinking, where you say, for example, with mental illness of a child, you would say, he's here and he's both here and sometimes gone if he has an episode. Or somebody with dementia, they're both here and gone. The German translation for my book, Loving Someone Who Has Dementia, didn't work, and they don't have a word for ambiguous in German. So they titled the book, Here But Yet So Far Away. I love that title. It's better than the one I had. And that describes many things that you people here in the audience are experiencing. A loved one is here, but yet so far away. And then there's the other side, where you have loved ones who are physically missing, as we see around the world today, and here in the United States after the hurricanes in the South. Hundreds are missing physically. They don't have a body, the families don't have a body to bury. They have no death certificate. They don't know for sure if the person is alive somewhere or if they are dead. Those kinds of ambiguous losses, both physical and psychological, are agonizing for the people who must experience them. So we try to build resilience because the problem really won't find an answer. If therapists say, or if the community says, as they did after 9/11 in New York, can't the families see that everybody in that smoking pile is dead? No, that's the problem. They can't see. And some people showed up in psychiatric wards with amnesia. Some people fled the country and went back to their homeland. And some people were found wandering around on the sidewalk in a daze. So it is hubris if we try to say a binary answer. Yes, they're dead. Yes, they're gone. Give up hope. No, that's not the way to move. Even if a person who is demented doesn't know your name anymore, you still should visit with them and talk to them and touch them. But it's a both and again. While you should do that, you also need a social life. So you both stay in contact with the person who is ill and develop new friends and new contacts to keep up your own spirit and health. So you may have questions about this both and way of thinking because it's not what we usually do. However, artists do it. Musicians do it, jazz musicians. They don't follow the order, the usual order. Abstract painters do it. And we can learn, I think, to tolerate ambiguity more if we push ourselves in those directions. By the way, I noticed that Laurie traveled a great deal, and I would think that traveling the world and learning to know different cultures would also stretch your tolerance for ambiguity, which may have helped you when you were faced with it in your own family. And Jonathan, you have coped so well too in your family, helping you do that by finding ways to accept what has happened to your body. I couldn't believe it when you said, even the wind touching your skin hurt. That brought tears to my eyes. I think you both demonstrate resilience that I'm in awe of. Thank you for sharing your story with me.
Lori, I have a question for you based on what Dr. Boss was talking about in terms of the yes and or sort of issue, especially with your son, somebody you raised. How do you manage the emotion, the memories of that person you raised and the one who you have now, the adult you have now, who is managing with their illness?
So I think for us it became a start and stop. I don't know if that makes any sense, but for us it did. It became what was is what was. And we had to develop a new normal. And our new normal today is better than it was. We are a stronger family. My daughter will attest to it. We talk about everything. That old term of the elephant in the room, the elephant is very visible, and when our son is off, we talk. Or when I'm off, we talk. Or my husband or my daughter or anyone else, we address things one-on-one. I think for us, that was one of the biggest changes, and it allowed us just to be able to find a new normal. But we're stronger now than what we were because of that.
Laurie, I don't know if you know the academic definition of resilience, but it isn't just being strong. It's exactly what you described. it's being strong and getting stronger because of the event that stressed you. So you are actually demonstrating that strength. As you say, you're a better family now than you were before. That's really admirable. So some people do make lemonade out of lemons, don't they? And come up better for it. We don't want everybody to have to do that. I want to emphasize that I like the idea that we can solve problems, we can find cures for diseases, and so on. But now and then there's a problem that has no solution, and that's what we're talking about tonight.
And Jeff, Jonathan, Jeff, because I've dealt with your family. Jonathan, I want to talk about how you managed the sort of, dealing with the person you were and managing with what you can do now, and how, do you say goodbye to your old life? Or is it an old life? Like, how do you view the way you used to be compared to what you are now?
I've always been a pretty positive person, and I think that's kind of helped me to get to the point where I am today. And I still believe that I'm going to get back to where I was. Obviously, different mindset than where I was before. But my goal from the day I got diagnosed with this has always been, I'm going to get back to as much of my old life as I possibly can. And I'm working towards that. The Montreal Pain Clinic has been a huge help in doing that, along with my family. It took me some time to kind of tell everybody what was going on, but once I did, it definitely helped to progress me mentally on where I am to get to today. Yeah.
Dr. Boss, if you care to respond.
Yes, I admire your optimism, and I'm sure it's helping in this. So if you did a both-and statement, how would you say it? I both still hope to get back to my way I was before, and I'm open to adapting, or how would you finish that?
Yeah, I definitely have adapted to what's going on with my body right now. I've had to train myself to use my left side rather than my right for almost everything. So I am kind of progressing in that sense at the same time, and just looking forward to seeing what comes next rather than just always considering and thinking about the pain that never goes away.
You sound flexible. By the way, that's a huge achievement to shift to the left side as you did. So you're still achieving things. They're just different than what you used to talk about, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Wow. Admirable.
Dr. Boss, I want to talk about the grief process as well, the grieving process when it comes to ambiguous loss. We're all familiar with the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross model of the 5 stages of grief. And having gone through, non-ambiguous loss recently in my life, I could probably not be in the same room as somebody asking me what stage of grief I'm in at this point. So, but it's, how relevant is that model now, that 5 stages of grief? Is it still usable? Should we still be looking to it? Is it relevant to ambiguous loss as well?
First of all, with a clear-cut death, it's not relevant. And as you say, you couldn't be in the room with somebody who brings up the 5 stages. Neither could Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her last 9 years of life. She was so angry about the misuse of those 5 stages. First of all, they were meant for the dying person, not for the family who is grieving. But second of all, she said, because she too was dying, she had several strokes. She wasn't able to walk after the big stroke, and she was 9 years disabled. And she said, it's messy. It's not a linear model, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so she wrote that in her latest books with David Kessler. So you have to go there to see what she wrote in her last years. But let me say this. It is messy. And while the 5 items she talks about, depression, anger, and so on, they're all pillars that happen, but they happen in a messy sort of salad bowl, all stirred up, and they come back again, and you repeat several stages. What we know now is that linear models are not useful. They, in fact, create an illusion that if you get through to step 5, you will feel better and you won't be sad anymore, which is untrue. So the current research in grief from death, is that you don't have to get over it. There is no closure. Rather, you need to find meaning in the death. And sometimes that's hard. With suicide, for example, or with soldiers killed by friendly fire, or things like that. With, let's say, an 88-year-old grandparent, the meaning is pretty clear. They've lived a good life. So, but that happens slowly. You don't know at the moment someone dies, you may not know the meaning of that loss for you, especially if it's a child or an infant and so on. And somebody who isn't 80 years old. So the current idea is to find meaning in your loss, a la Viktor Frankl, if you remember him. And that's true for ambiguous loss too, but it's harder to find. It's harder to find meaning in a loss that is unclear, but you can try. And oftentimes, the meaning people find with a missing person, either psychologically or physically, is that they honor that person somehow by living a good life themselves, or by finishing a project the absent person had started, or by memorializing. And I highly encourage memorializing a person who has died clearly or ambiguously lost persons. The Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. does that beautifully, with both soldiers who were killed and verified and soldiers who are missing in action. The best way to memorialize someone is to use their name. The statue of a human being is not very personal. What is personal is the name. And the 9/11 Memorial in New York City did that again as following the Vietnam Memorial, which was the first one to use the names, so that families can have a place to go and touch the name, put a flower on the name, because why? They don't have a grave to go to. So we encourage names for missing people. And when I worked in Japan after the tsunami, when so many people were washed away, encouraged even the small fishing villages to put up some kind of memorial, not elegant like the one in New York or the Holocaust museums, but a small memorial, perhaps on the beach, with the names of the missing people. The important thing is the names.
We've talked about sort of ambiguous loss with mental health, with physical health, with losing somebody who is at war. But what about divorce and ambiguous loss when it comes to that? How does that factor into ambiguous loss?
Well, first of all, that brings up another important condition. It depends on if the divorce is wanted or not. So if somebody wants the divorce, they probably don't have an ambiguous loss. They may think they have a gain. It's like in families where someone is transitioning gender. The parents and the siblings have an ambiguous loss, but the person who's transitioning is glad and has no feeling of loss or grief. So you have to, first of all, determine the context of the ambiguous loss. Now, most of the time, you and I know, it is tragic. And those are the ones we focus on because they're the most troublesome. But many divorces, for example, are not wanted by one of the parties, or maybe both, and probably not by the children either. So a lot of people in the system are affected by it. And I think it's good for them to have a name for what is distressing them. If I've never done anything else in my 50 years now of working on ambiguous loss, my contribution probably is that I gave a name to a kind of loss that heretofore had no name. We know from the stress literature that it's easier to cope with something if you know what it is. And so giving it a name, a situation like divorce or adoption, some of these more everyday things. I just worked with a group of people who are being let go. I think it's called retrenchment at a university. And they thought it was ambiguous loss. Indeed, it is for those who are retrenched and who love their jobs, the ones they're losing. So again, pay attention to the context of when this loss happens. Did you want it to happen? Did you want to lose this thing? Most of the time, the answer is no. But sometimes the answer is yes. So we have to be careful about not generalizing 100%.
I also we've alluded to this a little bit, but I wanted to get to it concretely. When we have ambiguous loss, and it may depend on the kind of loss, do we need closure? How much do we need closure? Should we seek it out? And it's like, I know it's a buzzword now, I need closure. We're going to talk about unfriending too, but I want to talk a bit about closure because
I just wrote this book, The Myth of Closure.
There we go.
Because I'm so
it's a myth.
angry.
So tell me, why is it a myth? Why is it the myth of closure?
Because nobody ever can close the door on a close relationship they once had. You can close the door on somebody you don't care so much about, but we're talking here about attachment, right? And if you were attached to somebody or something, because I'm going to include pets here, when they are lost, not died, you don't have a body to bury. When they are lost, you don't have closure. But when they die and you have a body to bury, there's still no closure. You're still going to think of them and remember them and memorialize them. Once they come into your heart as an attachment to somebody or something you love, you don't need closure. That's the other thing. You don't need it. What you need with loss is finding a meaning in it and some new hope, something new to hope for. You can't hope for the person to come back sometimes from the war or whatever it is. So you need to find something new to hope for. And that takes a while. I'm not talking about the day after you lose somebody. That may be a year later or more. It comes more easily if you're in a group, talk with other people about it who are in the same shoes as you are. Closure is a myth. It's a perfectly good word, however. I'm sure here in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, but also in Canada, when you get a really good snowstorm and the roads are closed. That's closure. So we announced that on the TV. We have some closures to announce today, and that's roads are closed because of a blizzard. That's a correct use of the term. It's also used in real estate when you have closure on a real estate deal. The people come and sign papers. It is cruel to use that word with people who have had a death in the family or with people who have ambiguous losses. It is cruel. It is very hurtful to them because they don't want to forget, nor should they have to. My husband died in 2020. He was 88. We had a good relationship. It was sad, of course, and the pandemic made it sadder because we could not have the church service we had hoped for, and other people gathering around. But it means that even now today, there will be an occasional moment when I'll have a tear when I see a play. We used to see plays together in theater. When I'm at the theater and I think of him, or when I hear a song he liked. That's normal. That's normal grieving, even if it happens 20 years after the person died. You do not have to forget them. You can have a sad moment anytime after. You don't want the raw emotion that came early on, though. That would be something you would have to see a grief expert on. But over the years, having a tear right then and there is normal. My sister was quite glamorous and wore bright colors all the time, whereas I tend to like black. And to this day, I mean, she died like 30 years ago. To this day, when I pass a store and I see a red dress in the window, I think of her and have a tear maybe at that moment, or at least just a smile or a sadness that I miss her. That's normal grieving. You don't have to get over it. Don't let anybody tell you that. It's cruel if they do.
Lori and Jonathan, I wonder if you have had comments or questions from people asking you if you've moved on or you have closure, if you've had to deal with those situations.
I have not, because I'm still dealing with CRPS right now. So I really haven't been asked any of those questions. I mean, still in the middle of it, right? So it's,
right.
Yeah.
And Lori, I wonder if people have asked you that.
So in our case, he's been very stable. The last 2 years have been really, really good. We still get the odd, with mental health, I think, and it may be similar for you, but with mental health, I think we've been approached a lot with, well, did he change his medication? Right? So I think a lot of people think you just take a new pill and all of a sudden everything goes back to normal. And we have learned that that is not at all the case. So for us, going back to what you just said, Dr. Boss, it's exactly that. That to me, as a mom, becomes, that's where it's cruel, right? Because that's not real. And while I completely understand a lot of people, you can't expect everyone to understand your story and understand, what you're going through as a family. But that, to me, has always been the most disturbing part of it when it comes to stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you're both doing it right. I don't sense in what you say and in your story that there's any closure that you've given up on the person or on yourself, Jonathan. I love to hear that's not true for either of you. So in your own families, you have had no closure, and I think you would be very angry at somebody who would hint at that, as you mentioned, Lori. But sometimes when, let's say it's terminal illness, cancer or something like that, people will and the person dies, and people will say, you must be relieved. And it's like, now you have closure, they'll say. Or when there's a court trial, a child has been murdered, and now the murderer is going to jail. People will say, this family now has closure. That's not true. They have justice. They don't have closure. So closure is just a terrible word to use with human relationships. And if anybody hints of it to you, just cut them off and just say, that's not how I see it.
But it's such a socially accepted thing to say for the most part. I mean, when I did a whole documentary about my father's death and dying and finding out from an autopsy and a brain sample, and I had so many people say, well, now do you have closure? And I was like, well, I don't have my dad, so that's not really a good thing, you know. So it still is a
and
very,
you remember him.
yeah, exactly. Like,
Of
I mean,
course.
it's just, you know, he died because of whatever, we still don't know of whatever happened. And it was, you know, people coming up and saying, well, you must have closure now that you did a whole documentary on it. I'm like, I could tell you journalists have done documentaries on a lot of things and don't have closure. So, yeah.
Right.
It's still
Do you know Anderson Cooper, Sonali?
Yes.
Anderson Cooper is the only media person in the United States who gets it, at least that I've heard. And he's had so many deaths in his family and the suicide of his brother that he actually will stop a panel on CNN if anybody says something about closure. I love him for it. And Stephen Colbert is another one on The Tonight Show. So there's something online you can Google. Anderson Cooper and Stephen Colbert both talking about the myth of closure, the lack of it. And in the beginning of my book, in fact, I quote them both. What we need is more media people, more people in the eye of the public talking about it and saying that there is no closure, but what you need to find is some meaning in the loss. But of course, death is not the most popular topic in the media, is it?
It's no. Yeah, it's not the top one of our story, every single story meeting we have. Actually, we have a lot of questions coming in, Dr. Boss and Jonathan and Lori. We don't mind if we get to some questions from the public. Do we have microphones in the room for people to ask questions? No, so they're just going to stand up and ask their questions. Okay, so I'm going to get to a question online. If you have a question, just stand up and I will try and get to you at some point. I think we do have a microphone. We do have a microphone? Okay, so we do have a microphone. Just stand up. We'll try and get to you. I'm going to get to online question while we come over there with a microphone first. You know, you were just talking about this, so I want to get to this question. There's somebody online asking about how you can find meaning in loss. What do you mean by finding meaning in loss?
Well, it comes from the ideas Viktor Frankl wrote in his book after he was in a concentration camp for so long. He found meaning in the suffering. He found that people who gave up and said, it's over, nothing of this makes sense to me anymore, they would die more quickly than the people who could find meaning. He found meaning in thinking about his wife, who oddly enough was in a building close to him, but he could never see her. And then later on, she had died and he didn't even know it, but he kept thinking about her. And the thought of his wife, and I give the quotes in the book, the thought of his wife kept him alive. It gave his suffering meaning. Now, you've heard prison stories, war prison stories similar to that, but more simply, when we lose a loved one, we should find some meaning in their life with us and how to carry on now. It's not so hard as you think, but it isn't the thing you'll think of immediately after someone you love dies. We're talking about a year or more before any of this makes sense to you. And as I said before, some deaths are harder to find meaning in than others. Then the meaning becomes, it's meaningless. It will never make sense. So then hopefully you find something else in your life to balance that does make sense. And we can do that. You know, my husband liked to write. He was in the theater and so on. But I like to write and I like to go to the theater too. But each time I do those things, I think of him in a pleasant way because we used to check each other's writing and he'd bring me a cup of tea and so on. Now I get the tea myself. But I think of him. So finding meaning is not very complicated. It's in the simple things. And that's it's a way to remember them, but not be obsessed by them. You don't want an obsession of the person who's lost. So it's just more gentle. And as I said, the meaning of my sister is I still admire women who dress in lively colors. It's just not me, but it was her. So those are sort of simple. If it's a difficult death, a baby dies, or as I talked about before, suicide, that's very hard to find meaning. Sometimes if there's a note left behind in a suicide, it helps to find meaning. But for the most part, that one might go down as a meaningless death. The meaning of that death is that it'll never make sense in the real way. That's okay too. That's a meaning.
I want to encourage everybody in the audience as well. I thought this was just online, but in the audience as well, you can email your questions to info@amiquebec.org, info@amiquebec.org. Even if you're here, send it that way. It's a lot easier to sort of get to the questions that way. It's just for technical purposes, it's a bit awkward to kind of bring the mic everywhere. So we're going to take this one question. Then if you can email your questions, then that would be fantastic. Let's just get to this one question. Yep.
Hi.
Yes, and just remind you that we do have to get to a lot of questions today.
Yeah, hi, my name's Kevin Skilton. I'm caregiving for my wife who has psychosis over the last 2 years, definitely having difficulty understanding any meaning in that whatsoever. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the word acceptance. And I guess I'm grappling with, I guess you can accept a situation as it is what it is, but are you losing something in that? Are you losing hope?
You're losing power. And that would concern me. So your question is a good one. It'll be hard to find meaning in that. But meaning sometimes can be outside your own situation. For example, and I'll get to acceptance in a minute. For example, when my little brother died of bulbar polio the summer before the Salk vaccine came out, the only way our family could find meaning is to join the March of Dimes effort. So we went house to house collecting dimes for the March of Dimes effort, which was for research, which, by the way, paid off. We do that still today. We never found meaning in Eddie's death. He was at Boy Scout camp one week and dead the next. We never found meaning in that. It didn't make sense for a 13-year-old boy who was strong to die that fast. But we found meaning in helping and volunteering for the purpose of preventing other kids from dying. So sometimes that is the way people find meaning. They find a new purpose. And for you, with your wife who has psychosis, one of the ways you're finding meaning in it, perhaps, is by being here tonight, being with this group, which does such great things because you have social contact. And not only social contact, but I believe you also get informational support, not just social support. You get good information from this organization. So I don't know if that helps you, but so meaning can be many different things. It can be purpose. Now, getting back to acceptance, I don't like the word, and I sense you don't either. Is that right?
Yeah, he doesn't like it.
Yeah. Because it seems to imply giving up your power. And boy, do you need some power now to withstand this stressor that you're dealing with, which is psychosis. So I think there's another word I would use. I don't like it when people say you have to accept this. I don't want to say I have to accept it. I can adapt to it. There are other ways you can say that. I know it's happening, but and I would externalize the blame. That's very important. The blame is not your wife. The blame is the psychosis. So you externalize the blame to the illness, not to the person who has it. And you can be mad in hell at that, but not at a person, at the illness. And so you can work to fight it like we did with polio. Work to fight the illness so it won't happen again. And action is helpful, by the way. Action is a helpful way of coping. It's better than just thinking about it all the time. And it also gives you power, gives you agency, when in fact the illness does not give you that. Any thoughts on that?
Well, actually, I wanted to talk to Lori, because you were nodding about that as well. What do you relate to that?
So I think I hear you with the psychosis side of things. My son has been dealing with it for years. And I think the comment that I was relating to quite well, and I was looking at my daughter because we used to say that all the time, we would get so angry, so frustrated, so how dare you take this from me? And it got to the point where we finally said, it's not our son that we're mad at. I love him to death. We will do anything for him. But I hate this illness. I hate what it's done to him. You know, so we learned how to redirect the anger to the illness, and that just honestly made us stronger in trying to find ways to work around the illness. It sounds crazy, but it was almost like we were trying to outsmart the illness, you know? How do we take the moments where he's amazing and enjoy them and bottle them, because when there's moments where he may not be, we can use that. That's what we did.
Very good. That's exactly right. Michael White, an Australian, developed the term externalize the symptom. I found it useful personally and professionally. Blame the culprit, but the culprit is not the person who carries the illness. The culprit is the illness. And be as mad as you want to that, but also work to prevent it from happening to others. Or as you're doing in this organization, that's exactly what you're doing by coming together, informing each other, supporting each other emotionally and with information. That's exactly a good coping mechanism to get back at this mental health issue.
I want to get to a question about resilience. In fact, we have a couple of questions about resilience. And a listener online had said, or viewer online said, I'm interested in hearing more about building resistance. Jonathan mentioned exploring meditation as a way to come to grips with his experience. And Dr. Boss mentioned attachment several times, both of which are central to the Buddhist ideology. Are there concepts to adopt from that tradition in helping us build resilience in the face of ambiguity? And Jonathan, I'll ask you a little bit more about how you use meditation now to help you cope with your illness.
I guess now I use it more when my pain levels are high, to try to get out of my body and kind of adapt to different ways of dealing with that pain. I think that's pretty much what I use it for mostly now. Sometimes also if I feel frustrated with the pain that I'm going through, or that I'm unable to do certain things, I'll use meditation to get through those difficult times for myself.
And how do you do it? Do you just do it in the garage away from everybody? Do you have a place or a particular environment that you need to do it in?
Not really. I've learned to kind of be able to do it anywhere. I could be sitting in a chair and just kind of let my mind kind of wander and recenter itself, and then bring it back to where I am to now. And I think that's kind of helped me to develop that. So even if I'm out, I'm able to do that pretty easily.
And Dr. Boss, we talked about this, about different traditions dealing with loss differently, and some handle it better than others. What are some concepts that are from other cultures that are interesting about dealing with loss, or that deal with loss differently than maybe what we know of in North America?
Well, you just mentioned the Buddhist tradition, and yes, it comes up in what I've been talking about. We're a very mastery-oriented society in the West, and we like to control, and we like to fix, and we like to cure, all of which are good things. But as I said before, now and then there's a situation you can't fix. And the Eastern cultures are better at that than we are, so we can borrow, especially from the Buddhist tradition. Meditation is indeed one way to do it. But, I was just at the Navajo Nation recently talking about caregivers for dementia there. But they don't meditate, they dance and they drum and they sing. Those can be ways to deal, to build resilience, to deal with a problem you don't want to be controlled by. So we find different ways to control ourselves if we can't control the illness. Meditation is one where you go inside and you control yourself inside because you can't control the outside. There's prayer. There's also music, dancing, as I said. And guess what people did, at least here in the States, during the pandemic, when they didn't know what this thing was that was killing so many people? People were desperate. Everybody was baking bread. Did you notice? Was that true in Canada?
Oh, yeah, we were all making I had a newborn, so I wasn't baking bread, but everybody else was baking bread, and I felt guilty that I wasn't in on this sourdough trend.
Well, yeast apparently was in short supply, so they came up with making their own starter and baking bread. What's that all about? It's about control. You can't control what's happening to you, the pandemic and the virus. So you find something you can control, even in isolation, which we all were. And that was, making a starter and baking bread. It's not a large project, but it's a project you can control, and it has a wonderful outcome. So I would say that's what you need to find. You need, because you can't control what happened to you, try to find something you can control. It's very important for the human brain. The human brain does not like ambiguity. And at least people in the Western cultures like to be in control. It needs to balance being out of control with the illness and being in control. Find something you can control to build resilience, whatever it happens to be. Listen to jazz music because it is about ambiguity. Listen to improvisational comedians. Go to improv theater. Do improv. Walk a new trail. Listen to a new kind of music. Figure it out, but do something different. Something you can control because you cannot control the illness. It has to balance.
This makes a lot of sense. I had a newborn, which is not in control. So
no, you won't be for a while.
Oh, no. Again,
but I hope you find something you can control.
Exactly. Again, in the audience, I want to remind you, if you want to ask a question, please send an email to info@AMI-Quebec.org so I can get your questions and ask them. We have a question about the loss of a pet. How can you deal with the guilt that comes when you are experiencing ambiguous loss? I am trying to cope with the loss of my missing pet. There is no closure as we don't know what happened to her, and it's difficult to cope as there are a lot of people who dismiss this as just a pet or blame me for letting my pet venture outside. To me, loss is loss and pain is pain. I feel guilty for not looking for her, not knowing if she's suffering or scared. It feels like life is on hold.
Oh my, I'm so sorry. Because it sounds like you were attached to her. And if we're attached to someone or something, then then it's a major loss, even though it remains ambiguous. If people say to you, you can just replace her with another pet, I hope you walk away or say, that's incorrect, or you can blame me and say, they're nuts. And that's not the way to help somebody who's grieving the loss of a pet. And if there was attachment, which it sounds like there is, then acknowledge your grief. Acknowledge your grief. Find meaning. If you can, talk about the meaning, things you did with your pet that you might want to remember, or you might want to work in your pet's honor at a shelter or something else. Figure it out. And find something you can control, because you're going to have this uncontrollable thing happen, being there for quite a while. The ambivalence is one of the 6 guidelines for living with ambiguous loss that I write about, and you mentioned it regarding guilt. I think it's good that you're acknowledging your guilt, but I would balance it with a both-and statement. I both feel guilty about my pet, and I know I took good care of her. Something that may not be correct, make it yours. But make it a both-and statement, because just saying I feel guilty and stopping there is not good for you. Because I'm sure you did some things right. And also finding meaning in that loss might be, as I said, doing something to remember her. Plant a tree or a rose bush or something in honor of her. I'm so sorry you lost your pet. I know that pets have become like family members. It's true for my son and daughter as well. I'm so sorry.
Let's move on to a question for Jonathan. I'm a sufferer of OCD and chronic pain going back decades. How did Jonathan deal with the pain involved in doing the research? I've struggled so much with it and I'm still limited in reading, for example. What does the doctor think of this?
I read a lot of different articles on CRPS, and unfortunately everything kind of amounted to the same thing, that there was no cure. Some people live with this for years. Some people are lucky enough that they go into remission pretty quickly. If you catch it early enough, you have that opportunity. I found continuously reading actually brought me into a downward spiral, which thankfully a few people told me to stay away. And it did. That's honestly what made a difference for me as well, was once I stopped reading about it and started thinking of how I can get better, that's really when I started to notice that I started to mentally improve, maybe not as much physically as I would have liked, but mentally that's where I noticed that I started to really move forward.
But when you are diagnosed with an illness and they tell you there's no cure, I mean, that is when you know, one of the pivotal moments of feeling ambiguous loss.
Yeah.
And Dr. Boss, that must be one of those moments that is kind of chooses how you deal with it. You've got to figure out at that point, when you're told you have an incurable illness, what do you do now?
Not right away. I mean, first you have to take that information in. I knew one woman who, when she was told about her brain-injured soldier husband by the doctor, she not in reality, but symbolically put the information in her pocket, she said, and took it out later. I always admired her for that, because sometimes these things come as a shock, and you're literally in shock when you hear them. She wasn't in denial. She was in denial for a couple hours. And, you know, I would even say a couple days might not be bad. Denial sometimes is functional at the beginning. It's not functional over the long term. And sooner or later, you have to start dealing with the problem. And Jonathan, you know, probably the reading wasn't the only thing wrong with reading. The other thing would be inactivity. Because that's what reading does. It makes you sit in a chair. And And so they find active coping is useful if you can be active, as opposed to just ruminating on one kind of inactive coping. Yet, as I said earlier tonight, getting information is also helpful. So it's a balance of balancing inactive coping mechanisms with active coping mechanisms. The active ones have a little more control and agency in them. Your brain feels more in control. It's less passive. So it's important to balance them.
Mm-hmm. And a question that Lori can probably answer. We have a question about family and social support. I hear that family and social support is so crucial to develop resilience. What if you have none of that? My family is hardened against my son who has a mental illness, so I have nowhere to go and do not know how to bring my family in so we can support each other. Any wise words?
Well, I have two answers. One would be, if there's any hope at all in any family members, I would find a family therapist or a good social worker to gather together on Zoom even or in person and go with the people who are willing to be family. That's not, sometimes there's nobody. But oftentimes it's a younger generation. It might be cousins instead of brothers and sisters. So I would go with the ones who want to be a family. However, when that doesn't work, I've written about what I call a psychological family. And many people have to do that, especially if they move far away from their relatives or if it is what you just described. Find some elderly people who are like grandparents. Find some people who feel like siblings to you, like a brother or a sister. Find some people who might be parenting you or mentoring, I think it might be more likely. You will find many people alone in this society right now because there are a lot of family rifts, and there is what's called ghosting, where kids won't talk to their parents anymore or parents won't talk to their kids, which is so harmful, I think. But psychological family is a family of like-minded people. You could meet them at some sports that you do together, or at a reading club, or at a music church choir, whatever. People that and what makes a psychological family? It's a family where you do the important rituals with them. Birthdays, holidays are spent with them. If your biological family won't do that, invite some psychological family to join in with you. I'm sure if you go around the block, there will be somebody else who also has the same problem. And it might not just be a willing rift in the family. It might be that they live so far away they can't get there for a birthday or a holiday. So do that. And also they're there for you in times of trouble. If somebody needs a ride to the doctor or seems to be called in the middle of the night, they would do that for you. Does that make sense?
Actually, I wanted Lori as well to weigh in on this.
So what I would add to that is, because I think that's very real. Building a bigger family is really important. I can share from my own experience what it was really more the denial, and I'll use that word because I truly believe that is what it was. The denial was not intentful or malicious or anything like that. It was really based on fear. That's what I learned. And the fear of the unknown, the fear of why he was acting the way he was, and sometimes very erratic, and sometimes, sending messages or text messages or talking out of tone or out of place. And people didn't understand that. And I found that what I did was start to break it down and have smaller groups And in those groups, we would talk, so I would, pick a couple of people in the family and we would go out for dinner, and it was a good release for me, but it was also an opportunity for them to get an update on what's going on and why he's acting the way he's acting. And eventually when the fear left, it started to get a lot more, okay, how can I help? Like, if I'm coming, for example, I'll give you an example. We do a lot of family get-togethers. He's not like that now, but in the first few years with this illness, we still encouraged those family get-togethers. And for people that couldn't understand, and we were talking about this earlier, people couldn't understand why he often would just have a space, like he would need a space to get away from that many people, right? And people would still try and, oh no, I'm just gonna talk to him. But that's, again, is the wanting to help, but it actually does more damage. So the more knowledge they had, the better it got. And today it's amazing because of that. So I would add that.
I suspect you had something to do with that too. That's the kind of family that doesn't need a family therapist. You did the right thing by giving them information. And because people who don't have, let's say, mental illness in the direct family, most people would not know what to do and therefore have some fear. And so you're educating them in a lovely, tender way, by yourself. Inviting them in and explaining things to them was exactly the right thing to do.
I imagine you had situations too. I've dealt with people who've had post-concussion syndrome, and we couldn't, for example, if we went there every year for Christmas or for New Year's Eve, they couldn't do it anymore because they couldn't take the noise or the light, and they needed a space for it. I imagine you had to explain that too, to we're not going to have the same kind of celebration because we can't. But what we are going to have a celebration, it's just going to look different.
It's taken us 4 years now. So for the last, I would say 4 years, well, COVID, minus COVID, to get to the place where we built up to it. It was originally just, our 4 or 5, and then it was like add 2 more, and then add 2 more. It was a slow process. And it was really as people started to get comfortable in understanding what he needed, and look, you love him, you want to do what's best, right. So they did, so yes.
And Jonathan, I wonder if you went through something similar where you had to sort of, you had to pull away from certain activities, I would imagine. What was that process like? And did you feel a sense of loss to I guess maybe the friends you thought you had, but the friends that you just couldn't do those things with anymore?
Yeah, for sure. It wasn't just friends, it was family too, family events that I couldn't attend because the pain was too much. So I missed out on a lot for the first, I'd say, 2 years of after my diagnosis, whether it was birthdays, holidays, hockey tournaments, whatever it was, hanging out with friends, going to hockey games. It didn't really make a difference what it was. I really had to kind of pick and choose the things that I was able to attend just physically, because it was pretty demanding to deal with, high levels of pain 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it was really a pick and choose kind of thing of what I had to deal with.
Yeah. I want to get to, sorry, Dr. Boss, did you want to respond?
Both of you describe both Anne's statements in a way, and I commend you on coping that way because it will get you through. Where you don't deny the illness. We both have an illness here, and we remember rituals and do them differently. And so that's the way to do it, is to balance the good with the bad in the statements you tell yourself.
I want to get to one last question. Believe it or not, we are at the end of our time, so I want to ask one last question. Dr. Boss, we've had a number of questions about managing with guilt. When you speak about finding meaning in ambiguous loss, how do you manage it with the guilt that comes with moving forward?
Well, Are you talking about the kind of guilt that says I was a bad parent, or it's because of me that my child has this illness? Or
I think there's a lot of different kinds of guilt here. We have another question about losing a career from mental illness, but considered lucky because you're obtaining benefits, even though you're losing, lifelong hopes and plans and social networks, but people think you may feel guilty because you don't have to work or you can't work, but also finding, the guilt of, being a parent and feeling like you may have caused something. How do you just deal with the guilt of ambiguous loss?
Well, I would acknowledge it. I mean, losing a career in order to become a stay-at-home parent is a big loss. So I would identify it and acknowledge it and talk about it with some other people, or a counselor or a therapist or a friend. In other words, don't bury it. You have a right to feel a loss and grief, because you have lost the friends at work, your career, your own identity. And the fact that is what you've lost. You've lost your identity, and you have to change it now. And the guilt, I think I would normalize it, because we do it so often. We feel guilty when we raise ordinary children. We feel guilty when an 80-year-old man dies, who's been very, very ill. I mean, almost when there's any death, people feel some sort of guilt. I think it's the human reaction to loss. And so don't beat yourself up about it. In fact, if you can, bring some humor into it. There I go again, that kind of thing. Talk about it with others who will, I think, reinforce you that you don't need to feel as guilty as you are making yourself feel, and normalize it. I think it's a normal reaction to a loss of someone to whom we were attached. And in your case with mental illness, it's a normal reaction to the health of someone we care about and took care of. Because we tell ourselves, if I had been a better parent, if I had done this or not done that, this wouldn't happen, which probably is not true. And so allow yourself to feel those feelings and talk to yourself or talk with others about it being nonsense, and normalize the guilt. Don't push it down, because it'll come up more if you do that. Talk about it, laugh at it. See that it is not true.
Well, Dr. Boss, I want to thank you very much for joining us this evening. It was incredibly helpful. Thank you for all your thoughtful questions as well that you sent in. And thank you, Lori and Jonathan, so much for being so open and honest with us. And thank you all for attending. We're going to have some closing words from Ella from AMI-Quebec.
Well, there was so much wisdom in this conversation that, I really have to reflect on many of the things. Let go of closure, hold on to resilience and to meaning, and so on and so forth. This is really, very stimulating. Thank you so much, Lori and Jonathan. I think that this evening would not have been the same without you, so that's really quite wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Boss. Thank you, Sonali. I also have to give a very special thank you to Tony and David, who made this possible. You probably don't appreciate how difficult it must have been, but really, thank you so much. I really don't think that without you, it could have been, happening. Thank you again to all of you for being here. Just reminding you to please visit our website, call us at 514-486-1448, and see you next time. Thank you.